Well, good morning, everyone. I am Clark Irvin. I'm the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute's Homeland Security Program and also the Executive Director and the founder of the Aspen Security Forum. Last night was our unofficial opening, and this morning is our official opening. So on my own behalf, let me welcome all of you to our 5th Annual Security Forum, and I couldn't be more pleased that you're here. I want to, myself, thank our sponsors, IBM, Intel Security, Microsoft, Raytheon, and Target. And I also want to thank our special media partners, CNN and the New York Times. Just one advertorial word. A number of our speakers and our moderators are authors, and we have their books just behind you, thanks to Explorer Bookstore here in Aspen. And so I hope during the course of the breaks and the lunchtime sessions, you'll have occasion to browse through them and pick up those that are of interest to you. This morning's session is titled U.S. Counterterrorism Strategy and Its Implications for Emerging National Security Threats. And we couldn't have assembled a better panel to discuss these issues and a better moderator to lead this morning's discussion. And that moderator is Brian Ross. Brian Ross is one of the country's most honored and respected journalists. As ABC News' chief investigative correspondent, he reports for World News with Diane Sawyer, Nightline, Good Morning America, and a host of other ABC programs. His reports have exposed corruptions at all levels of government. I was the Inspector General at the State Department and the Homeland Security Department. I first came to know Brian and his team during the course of that work. And I can tell you personally that, as it says here, his reporting has led to changes in our government domestically and also in work abroad. He has received some of the most prestigious awards in journalism, including 6 DuPont Awards, 6 Peabody Awards, 6 Polk Awards, and 5 awards from the Overseas Press Club. With that, my friend Brian Ross, who will lead this morning's conversation. Again, thanks to you all for being here. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Clark. Thank you very much, Clark and Walter. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be asked to be part of this important symposium. And our topic to kick off this session could not be more important, especially given overnight developments. As you may have seen, an Algerian airplane disappeared and now apparently has crashed somewhere in the desert. It was in an area of violent weather, but also in an area of violent terrorists who are known to have shoulder-fired missiles. At the same time, in Norway, the Interior Minister reported that they had concrete evidence that the country would be hit by a terror attack in the next few days by perhaps Norwegians who had been trained in Syria and come back home. So the issue of counterterrorism is one that is always on the minds of everybody in this panel, and the reason why they never have a summer vacation that goes uninterrupted. Due to circumstances beyond our control, which included a closed runway, bad weather, and United Airlines, 2 of our original panelists could not make it. But they are being filled in for quite ably by Juan Zarate. Juan Zarate was for 4 years essentially the counter-terror czar at the White House, and before that, the first Assistant Secretary of Treasury in charge of trying to stop terror financing, and the author of one of those books now on sale at a special discount. I understand. Treasury Wars, yeah, you can get a signature on it. Next to Juan is John Carlin, who is the Assistant Attorney General for National Security. He is the man who brings all of the major cases you read about, who's involved in virtually everything that happens in the counterterror world in terms of prosecution, in terms of what happens with the NSA. Couldn't be a more pivotal person. And then finally, Mike Vickers, who's the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and has been there now for 8 years. Is that right, Mike? Yeah.
8 years and 2 jobs.
Right. Yeah. And on a point of personal privilege, let me just say that my first experience with counterterrorism took place 32 years ago when I was held hostage by terrorists in Honduras for 3 days on a flight in Tegucigalpa. And Mike was the Special Forces operator who came in to help save me, and John Negroponte, who's here in the audience, was the ambassador at the time. And I never had a chance to thank you publicly, but I want to say to both of you, So with that, let me start with you, Mike. Give us a sense over the last year of what you think in terms of the great tools that are available to the U.S. with Pentagon, Justice, Treasury, State. What would you say has been the single most important accomplishment from your point of view?
Okay, thanks, Brian. So I focus on intelligence and operational issues, and so let me talk about that. First, in terms of most important tool and accomplishment. First, the war against Al-Qaeda largely occurs outside of zones of armed conflict, so outside of Iraq after 2011 and Afghanistan. Most of it has been in other countries. The second is it occurs across multiple countries and even continents, and so that has big implications for our strategy. So making a couple points, this is an intelligence war. Intelligence drives operations. Good foreign intelligence collection is essential to everything we do, and then all source analysis to understand the threats posed and the strategies of the groups we're trying to counter. As the name implies, the CIA is our central intelligence agency in this effort, but it is an effort that spans the intelligence community. NSA, our National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, FBI, DIA, all play really critical roles, as does our National Counterterrorism Center. Then turning to, intelligence is necessary but not sufficient. What do you do with the intelligence? And then we move into the realm of action. And we have two basic methods: indirect, working with international partners to capture them, to enable, and they span the gamut from the French in Mali to individual host countries who help us critically. The Pakistanis and Yemenis in particular have done very important things in this regard. Our preference is always to use this indirect route and work through partners because of the distributed nature of the threat. But that isn't always possible. It depends on whether they're capable and then willing. We have capacity building programs at state across all of us here, Department of Defense, and the IC. Direct action then involves our special operations forces, bin Laden raid, capture operations in Libya recently, and then predator strikes. So of those tools, since 2008, when the war in Al-Qaeda really got expanded in areas outside of armed hostilities, our single most important instrument in degrading Al-Qaeda has been the predator strikes, hands down. It doesn't mean it'll be the most important going forward in the future. It's still essential today, but it has been our most important. And then in terms of our most important accomplishments over the last year, as this terrorist threat has decentralized and metastasized. I mentioned the capture operations in Libya, one against an Al-Qaeda operative who was involved in the embassy bombings in 1998, and then one of the Benghazi perpetrators. Our partners have done capture. Top Al-Qaeda high-value targets have been taken off the battlefield. But probably the most single important accomplishment of the last year, we had very, very serious threats emanating out of Yemen last summer. You may have read about this. And some very rapid action not only disrupted that threat, but set it back. And again, that was largely predator strikes that did that. And so with that, I'll conclude.
And John Carlin, so at the Department of Justice, you can certainly prosecute people after the fact. What role and what's the most important thing you think you do in terms of trying to stop it before the attack?
No, that's a great question. And it's good to be here with my colleagues. I thought I was going to bat cleanup, but we lost 2 of the 4 for the State, Treasury, and Department of Defense. We all work together regularly in National Security Council. Our division, the National Security Division, which was the first new litigating division of the Department of Justice in about 50 years, was created post 9/11 as the one central place within the department to handle all of the different national security threats on both the intelligence side of the house in terms of authorities and proceedings in front of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and also the ability to take action, whether through law enforcement or other means. And so if I was able to bat cleanup, I was going to claim credit for everyone else's accomplishments because fundamentally for us, we need to be dedicated to an all-tools approach. And our philosophy as the bridge to the intelligence community at the Department of Justice has to be, what can we do to work within the existing legal frameworks to enable the operators to do what it is they need to do to keep us safe? And so I think Mike has mentioned one accomplishment that involved working together hand in hand in a more traditional sense, which is obtaining the perpetrator of or one of the perpetrators of the Benghazi attack, and bringing him to face justice in an American courtroom. But we've also worked hard this year to continue to enable the operators to have the legal authorities to obtain the intelligence they need that supports some of the other operations that Mike was discussing. And I think it's been a year where there's been a lot of healthy debate and some changes in the regime for the collection of intelligence. But at the end of the day, we've been able so far to maintain the flexibility that we need and get the critical intelligence for our operators when they need it. And then I'll jump for Juan a little bit, but on the sanctions regime, we've tried to make sure that whatever tool we're applying, whether it's direct military action, whether we're working with a partner so they can develop a legal framework so they can take action, for instance, against the foreign fighter threat, or working with Treasury on sanctions, that we look at each threat holistically. Who's the group that we're trying to stop? How is it that they're able to do what they want to do? And what tools can we, as a government, what lawful tools can we bring to stop it? And so that means thinking through, do we have a criminal justice option? Do we have an opportunity to take direct action? And can we support and review whether it's lawful to sanction an individual or entity through the Department of Treasury? And I think as the threat has become more diffuse, it's become even more important to be able to have these very fact and circumstance-specific solution on the terrorist front to smaller scale groups operating under a wider series of terrain to make sure that wherever the country, whether it's governed or ungoverned, where the activity is taking place, that we can provide an appropriate tool to detect and disrupt the actors.
And Juan, you pioneered the approach of essentially follow the money to go after the terrorists. Does that really work?
It does. In all honesty, there's lots of folks who are part of that, and there was decades of development in terms of the use of financial power to try to influence and go after the enemy's budget and to try to undercut their ability to have global reach. It does work. It does work at several levels. First, it works as an intelligence tool. I think one of the things that happened post 9/11 was a recognition that we needed more intelligence about how our enemies were thinking about attacking the United States. And one key element is obviously financial information. Financial information can reveal relationships, support networks, and frankly then information about potential attacks. And so following the money to allow for disruption and to understand what the enemy is doing is critical. Another thing that it allows you to do is to understand where the enemy has vulnerabilities and weakness. Where do they have exposure to the types of powers that, for example, the Treasury Department has to isolate actors from the formal banking system or to blacklist individuals or entities from the global financial system? So I think without a doubt, what you've had in the post-9/11 era, and to John's point, sort of a flexibility of the use of all tools in the national construct, is the ability to use financial power in addition to military power, in addition to legal tools, in addition to a panoply of other tools that the U.S. government brings to bear, along with partners, to try to go after enemy activities. That said, there are limitations to these tools. And I think one of the challenges that John and Mike and others who are driving our counterterrorism strategy and campaign now is that the environment has shifted. Not only has al-Qaeda metastasized, you have the growth of a new movement, ISIS, or they call themselves the Islamic State. They've found new ways to raise and move money. ISIS has learned to run a war economy. They run oil refineries. They control food granaries. They tax and extort. They rob banks. And so the classic tools that we've used in the past to isolate actors, in particular from the banking system, are less apt for the actors that have learned to take advantage of local opportunities. And a big challenge, you mentioned North Africa, a big challenge there, of course, is the kidnap for ransom trade, which has brought al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb tens of millions of dollars in revenue because of the payments in that, what is now an industry for them. So I think we're at a point, whether it's in the context of financial power or the use of other tools, where we're having to adapt to a changing environment and needing to learn how we preserve these authorities to be able to go after a very dynamic and changing environment. And I think that's really the challenge moving forward. I think we've had great success in the past, but the environment is shifting, and things are growing more complicated, more diverse, some would say more dangerous. And the question is, are we going to have the tools and the flexibility moving forward to be able to deal with those threats?
So with two very well-financed terror groups, ISIS, or IS, they call it, and the Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, they are immune to those kinds of moves then, right?
Well, I think they are in some ways. And I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago talking about that we are challenged by the fact that there is now a very different dynamic in the context of the way terrorist groups fund themselves. They obviously have these local means to raise money. Syria itself, and we talked about this last year at this forum, I think importantly, Syria has rejuvenated many of the old networks that had supported jihadi causes, dating back to the old Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in those days. And so there's a resurrection of these old global networks, support from countries like Qatar and Kuwait that proved problematic. If David Cohen from the Treasury were here, he would articulate that, as he has publicly already. And so there is a real challenge of a local and global terrorist funding regime that's emerging again, amid conflicts that see no end. You know, Syria is a festering conflict. So you not only have the foreign fighter problem emerging from there, but the innovations on how to fund and run terrorist organizations for the long term. And that's a real challenge.
So Mike Vickers and John, what do you see as the greatest threat then to the U.S.? These are threats in their local and regional areas, but to the U.S. homeland.
Yeah, so the number of groups who aspire to Salafi jihadi ideology is expanded. Number of attacks are expanding, but overwhelming majority of those are really focused on what they call as the near enemy, or the country they're involved in. The most dangerous threats to the American homeland emanate from Syria, from Yemen, and still from the tribal areas of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. And then ISIS or ISIL also has aspirations. It's focused on its area right now, but it is in a competition for leadership of the global jihad with Al-Qaeda, and that competition, of course, you know, who can be the baddest and biggest, and so they're a threat not to be discounted as well.
The only, in agreeing in terms of the foreign picture, the only addition I would add would be those who are homegrown violent extremists who are inspired by an ideology of violence and hate abroad. It's much more difficult to disrupt a lone individual who's inspired and wants to take action here, and it requires an agileness and nimbleness to be able to try to detect it and disrupt it before it occurs.
When I was here last year on the panel with John Pisto, we talked about the Yemeni bomb maker, who continues to be a great threat to the U.S., I take it.
Yeah,
that is unresolved.
Ibrahim al-Assiri.
And with all our tools, he's still there.
He's still there.
And
Brian, just to that point, I think the danger with Ibrahim al-Assiri is not just his evil genius, the fact that he's training others. And I think this is also reflective of the challenge of the current environment, because you have the regional sort of affiliates or outposts of Al-Qaeda in some ways beginning to cooperate much more aggressively and materially with each other, with Syria as kind of an amplifying factor. Along with then sort of energy and enthusiasm for this new Islamic State that's generating attention around the world. And so, you know, the environment is much more complicated than when I was at the White House. I think much more dangerous in that you don't have necessarily this classic divide between groups that were so focused on the local and then groups like Al-Qaeda that were trying to drive attacks against the U.S. In many ways, the environment is now both local and global. These groups can do both and are doing both. They're collaborating in a much more dynamic way. And in fact, John and his team have prosecuted folks like Warsame, who were serving as the connective tissue between some of these groups like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Al-Shabaab. And so the real danger here is you not only have an Islamic State growing and drawing adherence and attention and funding, but these other sort of outposts beginning to connect with each other and provide support, fighters, training, and expertise like the type that Ibrahim al-Assiri brings to the table.
John, we see increasingly a number of cases being brought against alleged homegrown jihadists or people who material support for terrorism. Is that because there are more of them? Are you doing a better job? Both?
It's hard to answer because I'd say both. I think the community, when I was at FBI working as Chief of Staff to Director Mueller, The Bureau, working with Department of Homeland Security and state and locals, made just leaps and bounds in their ability to collect and act upon intelligence to prevent terrorist attacks before they occur. And so one result of that then eventually is filtering through the system in additional criminal prosecutions. But we are also seeing a spike in terms of the interest in joining violent jihad abroad, and in particular the attraction for to be a foreign fighter in the Syria/Iraqi, northern Iraq area. And we've seen that phenomenon before. We just had a case announced today in terms of individuals raising money and seeking to facilitate travel to Somalia to fight with al-Shabaab. But the number of foreign fighters that are already in place in Syria and the number of Westerners in that group is one that's unprecedented, and I think is a larger number than we ever saw in the ungoverned spaces of Pakistan and Afghanistan region.
More likely to bring a threat to the homeland, do you think, Mike?
Which ones?
The sort of the foreign fighters recruited to Syria and Iraq?
Yes, well, a lot of them go there to fight the local wars, but others are skimmed off for external operations, and yes, that's their aspiration, and it's a near-term threat.
If I could just comment on that, I think Syria is a disaster, right? A disaster from a threat perspective, because in part you do have thousands of foreign fighters flowing in and out. Very hard to track them, hard to know what they're going to come back to do. The Norwegians are dealing with it, the Europeans are very worried, the Australians are worried. It's a global problem. Second, it's animating the movement itself, and so there's an attractiveness to what's happening both in Iraq and Syria that's drawing adherents, drawing professionals. There are groups coming out of Southeast Asia of doctors, theologians, and others that are going in to support these extremist movements to help them govern. And it's allowing them sort of breathing space to innovate and to coordinate. And that's really, I think, the lesson of counterterrorism is anytime you give terrorist groups, those that are organized, that have global ambitions and potential reach, the ability and the breathing space to operate, to innovate, to strategize, to make connections, that's a prescription for disaster. And I think that's a real problem with Syria as it festers.
So just two more points on that. One, the number of foreign fighters who are Western passport holders, including Americans, is a subset of that. Numbers in the 4 digits. So it's a serious problem. And then the second point is the foreign fighter flow across the board, Western and non-Western, going into Syria is much larger than it was in the Iraq War, at the height of the Iraq War. So it gives you a sense of the magnitude of the problem, and Juan hit the nail on the head about sanctuary. That's the critical thing you got to take away from any terrorist group that aims to attack our homeland.
So let me ask you now, you have these tools, and you guys actually sit down together and talk about this, but who decides what is the U.S. going to do? I mean, yes, you can have a coordinated attack, but somebody has to make the decision, somebody has to take the lead, right? Should it be a military action? Should it send in the FBI? Should we just go crazy and shut down the money?
Well, we do all of the above.
I know you do all of that, but at some point, and
Yeah.
and in a way, Juan, you essentially ran that operation when you were at the White House. How do you decide, and who decides, and what are the complications that result?
Well, I think on complicated sort of matters, especially those that have strategic impact and sort of ancillary effects or externalities, that gets coordinated by the National Security Council. And I was honored to work for Fran Townsend, who's here, and Steve Hadley. And it happens in the context of the leadership of the agencies that have authorities and the White House sort of setting the strategy. And so at the end of the day, when you have a complicated maneuver, when you have to use military power, you have to use intelligence resources, you have to think about using law enforcement or Treasury tools or other tools, that then has to be part of an integrated strategy and execution. And the way that we've operated post 9/11 is that's usually driven by the White House in coordination with the agencies that have that authority. And frankly, it's the White House that sets the strategy. It sets the parameters. It sets the policy and the expectations. And at least when we were in the White House, the idea was you give the authority and the execution to the agencies. Let them do their work. White House sets the strategy.
So is the military an option first choice or last resort, from what you've seen?
Well, it's last resort, and as I mentioned, we prefer capture and detain for intelligence purposes to lethal direct action. We prefer indirect action, working with partners to direct action, but when we have to do direct action, we do.
Could it be more robust, John?
Well, I did want to, we said it somewhat jokingly, but all of the above. And I think Juan was saying it in a different way by saying integrated strategy. The experience I've had working day in, day out, and way too many meetings with Mike in windowless rooms, but has really been one of looking at the different threats, trying to get as granular as you can from the help of NCTC and the intelligence community at how's this particular threat actor seeking to accomplish their means, and then running through all of the different authorities that we can bring to bear. And it's a complicated, diverse threat, and so it's almost always the case that we're applying nearly our whole tool set simultaneously with almost every actor that you can think of. And I think when Mike was saying last resort, it's probably true of direct action given on the threat, but there are so many other ways the Department of Defense can contribute in terms of providing training and assistance to foreign partners, the collection of the intelligence that's providing the ability to levy a sanction or bring a law enforcement action. So to give you a real flavor of how it's working, it's that. It's running through what exactly do we know about the group and a laundry list. Here's what everyone can bring to the table given the fact situation that we have now. Let's move it with all these tools simultaneously.
And I would say then when you look at our counterterrorism strategies as applied to specific groups or countries or region, they're very tailored approaches. So in the Sahel, in Mali, northern Mali, after Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb took over the northern half of the country, the French intervened and we provided an important enabling role. And that was the right solution for that. In other cases, it's a different set of instruments.
How do you deal with personal and institutional egos? They don't exist inside Washington. Juan?
I would say you cater to them. Well, it's inevitable. I mean, you do actually, in these kinds of positions, the positions that John and Mike and others hold, you want powerful, confident people, because these are significant and perhaps even historic positions and decisions that people have to make. And so you want people who are confident, but you also want people who are self-reflective. And you want a process that actually challenges assumptions and allows for good decision-making. I do want to come back to this point of how decisions are made, because I think some of those processes are well-worn. You get certain conflicts, like the question of, is the CIA or is DOD sort of in charge of how we use targeted killings and that sort of thing. But I think moving forward, the real challenge is, do we have the appropriate strategy for dealing with what is a more complicated and diverse counterterrorism problem? The president announced at West Point sort of a regional approach, which I think is right. It's not unlike what President Bush was doing, frankly, in terms of the use of the French in Mali and leveraging their authority, or the Kenyans and the Ugandans and the African Union and Somalia, et cetera. So the regional approach is right, but the question is, how do you dislodge groups that are growing in power and reach and influence if there isn't the local capacity, if we don't have boots on the ground, if we don't have the ability to dislodge? And I think that's a real challenge. And I think the complementary challenge is, are we going to have the panoply of authorities that we've had to date to deal with the diversity of this threat in terms of surveillance, in terms of use of targeted strikes when necessary? We've raised the level of standard in terms of near certainty in terms of the use of those tools. Detention, what does our detention policy look like, especially as we draw out of Afghanistan? You look at a lot of these terrorist leaders, including Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who now has proclaimed himself the caliph. He was once in U.S. custody, right? Zarqawi was once in Jordanian custody. And so if we're seeing this as a long and enduring conflict that has a changing shape and scope, I think we have to come to grips with what are the authorities and strategies we're going to have moving forward, and what does that look like given the balances that we have to draw. I think that's really the difficulty that policymakers now have. versus who does what.
Well, are we tough enough? Is the U.S. tough enough?
We're the biggest, baddest in the business. I don't think there's a question of whether or not we're tough.
Are we too tough?
No, I don't think so. I think our enemies need to fear us. There's no question about that. And I think we need to demonstrate that we can bite. And I think when we allow our enemies to have breathing space, to gain comfort and a sense that they're not going to be harmed, I think that's not good. One interesting debate that's emerged actually between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, because there has been this rupture. And it's been simplified in sort of the media as, well, ISIS is just too brutal. They're beheading too many people. They're too extreme, so Al-Qaeda is like, that's really not it. Al-Qaeda prefers a more tactical approach when dealing with a variety of enemies, no doubt. We saw that with Zawahiri's letter to Zarqawi saying, don't behead so many people, just put a bullet through their heads, right? So that's the level of gentility of Al-Qaeda. But the reality is they have a different strategic sort of agenda in mind. And Al-Qaeda's is that it's premature to be announcing the Islamic State. It's premature to be attempting to galvanize the caliphate in this way and the movement in this way. And one of the reasons I think Al-Qaeda has come to this position is that they've been hit very hard over the last 12 years by the U.S. They learned very, sort of up close and personal that if they poke the United States, they'll wake the sleeping giant and we'll come after them. And I think that's an important lesson because in some ways it begins to constrain the imaginings and strategies of these groups. And I think at a certain moment you do have to demonstrate that you're willing to fight and you're willing to bite very hard to constrain the ambitions of these groups. We're not doing that now in Syria, and that's a problem.
John and Mike, let me ask you, you're on the inside. In the year since Ed Snowden released his documents and went public, has there been any pullback by the U.S., any hesitancy to do the same things we were doing before Snowden?
No,
We've been cowed by Snowden and the release in the media.
No, I mean, as the president announced, we did a comprehensive review of our SIGINT policies in the aftermath of that. And, our collection, with some adjustments, continues very robustly.
What do you say?
So, I think, to Mike, I think what you'll hear from folks in the intelligence community is, has there been some loss by the public discussion of the techniques and method and disclosure of classified information? Yes, I think we'll hear it from NSA and others that it's more challenging to collect what they once did as the adversary becomes more aware of how they can prevent their information from being collected. Right now, I'll defer to the colleagues, but I think we're hearing that we still have the legal and policy architecture that provides the nimbleness we need to do the collection, assuming that.
Was there a lasting effect, a negative effect by Snowden's disclosures, would you say, Mike?
So I would say John made an important point. It isn't just Snowden. There were other unauthorized disclosures by anonymous people that harmed our intelligence capabilities. But our intelligence apparatus is very robust, and the policy and authorities are still there. Also, the environment changes all the time, and adversaries adapt, and so you have all those things going on to shape that collection environment.
But a year ago, there was a lot of, I would say, hand-wringing that this really has hurt the U.S. Would you say now, a year later, that was accurate?
No, I would say, just speaking for him alone, what he did and took across the board, David Sanger mentioned yesterday about the multiplicity of threats facing the country. He touched on a lot of those, and it's very, very harmful.
I think there have been some lasting effects. First of all, you look at the diplomatic impact. Look at the relations with Germany at a fairly critical time in the context of Russia and Ukraine. So there's been damage there. Damage in terms of the trust with the private sector. And I think that's something that's going to be with us for some time. At a fairly critical moment when we were beginning to innovate with how the public and private sector work on things like cybersecurity, where it's essential for there to be interaction between the government and the private sector, which holds the vast majority, 80–90% of the internet infrastructure is in private hands. And so it's done huge damage in terms of that trust and confidence, and also to the ability of American companies to do business abroad. We're seeing reports out of China that U.S. companies are being disfavored and are able to do that. The last thing I would say is this was interesting moment for Snowden to have done this, because the U.S. government had begun to be very open, and you saw this from the DNI and from the military, about what the Chinese and the Russians were doing in cyberspace, much more open than in the past. And you had private sector entities coming out with reports, et cetera. And so right at the height of a discussion as to what do we do about these very difficult problems, the largest transfer of wealth in modern history, according to some, then we had the Snowden leaks. And it changed the debate, it changed the context, it changed this argument of moral equivalency with countries like China. And so I think those are lasting effects, regardless of whether or not we can recapture collection on particular terrorists or not, because I think we will be able to. But I think those are lasting impacts that are really problematic.
We're going to go to some questions, but first, before we do that, I want to talk about an emerging threat of the cyber threat. And John, give me a sense of how you see it today in terms of the threat from cyber attacks, cyber terrorism.
We absolutely have to be focused on the national security cyber threat. I think we've become, since maybe 05 to 07, we've become much, much better at observing what is currently going on in terms of the information that, as we speak, is being taken from hardworking Americans who are looking to create and innovate, and it's being stolen day in, day out, and used by their competitors to the disadvantage of the American companies. And so from our perspective, we have to apply the same type of approach that we did to terrorism, to the national security cyber threat. And we've talked some about the all tools approach. And we had not made the same progress in applying that approach to the cyber threat as we had to the terrorism threat. I know in our division, we've worked very hard over the last couple of years to ensure that all across the country, U.S. attorneys in every office have people assigned, trained, and focused on national security cyber threats, and working closely with the FBI, and applying the same model we did to terrorism. FBI is now sharing what were formerly the intelligence files with the prosecutors, even though 95% of those cases may never see the light of day, to make sure that we're providing the criminal justice system as a potential tool in the toolkit. And you saw the success of that approach, in that some said that just surely it would be too difficult to bring a case against these national security cyber actors. And we heard directly from the Chinese that said, if you have evidence, hard evidence, that we're committing this type of activity that you could prove in court, show us. So we did. And we indicted 5 members of the People's Liberation Army from Unit 61398 for their activity cutting across the span of different American businesses, from nuclear to solar to steel to labor. And that's a step, but it can only be the first of what has to be a multi-pronged strategic approach, where at the end of the day we say, this is a red line. We will continue to increase the cost to you of committing this type of activity on American soil, which is where it's occurring when they're taking the information, until it stops. And we need to maintain that commitment. But looking ahead on cyber terrorism, and the 9/11 report just gave an updated report, we're in in some respects, 9/11 moment with cyber. It's clear that the terrorists want to use cyber-enabled means to cause the maximum amount of destruction as they can to our infrastructure. It's clear because they have said it. Zawahiri put out a videotape statement saying, we want to commit a cyber attack against the United States. It's also clear that other actors, nation-state actors, and certain sophisticated criminal groups have the capability now to cause significant damage. You saw attacks against Saudi oil company with the Shamoon virus to Aramco, where they wiped out 30,000 computers. We recently took down a criminal case, Game Over Zeus. This was a criminal organization. It used a botnet that infected hundreds of thousands of computers, and they combined the botnet, the infected computers, with a ransom program. So they'd go into your data, they'd encrypt it, and they'd say, pay me X number of dollars if you want to see your data again. And I think many of the people, given the industries that you're in this room, would pay because of the important information that we keep, and sometimes life-saving information if you think about medical records. That was a criminal group, and they did it for profit. If a terrorist group gets that same type of access or capability, they're not going to ask for money, and they're not going to wait before they try to destroy the data. So there's a real urgency, I think, now, and it is going to require private and public sector cooperation, given how much of the infrastructure is in private hands. And it would be a shame, and I think it can't and won't happen, that we let legitimate disclosures and debates keep us from addressing this threat before we're looking backwards at what happened and wondering how we got there.
Let's take some questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Testing. Thank you very much, and good morning. My name is Josh Rogan. I'm a reporter with the Daily Beast in Washington. Thanks so much for giving us your time today. Mr. Vickers, you said the number of foreign fighters with Western passports in Syria was in the 4 digits. Mr. Zarate, you said it's a disaster. As you know, there's a debate in Washington, both inside and outside the administration, about whether or not to arm the Syrian rebels, the vetted Syrian rebels, with the weapons that they wish, mainly anti-aircraft and anti-tank weapons. Some say that, given the rise of terrorism in Syria, now is not the time to put pressure on Assad. Some say that Assad is the magnet for terrorism. The only way to solve it is by toppling Assad. Given the MH17 crash, do you think the environment now is right for providing anti-aircraft weapons to the moderate Syrian rebels? Do you think it's made more difficult by that situation? And ultimately, which side of this debate do each of you fall on? Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start. So first, as the president has made clear, strengthening the moderate opposition in Syria is a real strategic imperative for us. I mentioned, number one, Syria is probably the number one threat, or with Yemen, threats out of Yemen to the American homeland right now and elsewhere in the West. Second, when we look at how we do CT operations, we always want a partner. Is that partner capable and is it willing? In Syria, we don't have that. So it's good to have friends on your side. The stronger the moderate opposition gets, the better we will be going down the road. That's not the only counterterrorism instrument that we would necessarily apply, but you got to have tools to fight. And then to your other point, is Assad a magnet? Yes, he is a magnet. Syria is a very, very difficult foreign policy problem, but it's one that's really in our interest to get a handle on. As far as the types of weapons that you equip them with, we have debates on the quantity and quality as well, and I'll leave that one for another day.
Next question. Yes, sir.
Would you address Inspire just a moment? We've seen, notwithstanding getting rid of Anwar al-Awlaki, Inspire magazine or effort has become more sophisticated. They've gotten into greater graphics, gotten into tradecraft. That from a homeland perspective is especially troubling, as it inspires folks here, notwithstanding the foreign fighters in Syria, with more explicit instructions and concerns about not, moving away from the suicide bombing approach and getting into the tradecraft to protect the potential Tsarnaev brother type individual. Could you address that aspect of it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Inspire is recovered, and there's also been a proliferation of these English language magazines by jihadi groups. There are now 4 or 5 of them, I think. So it's a persistent threat, that isn't going away.
I'd say we're in the internet, and the ability to communicate at low cost and instantaneously has been a tremendous boon, obviously, for our economy and for the world. But with it comes the capability of those who want to communicate messages of hate, and also the tactics in terms of how to accomplish their violent ends has become easier than it's ever been in human history. And Inspire is one example, but you're seeing others also try to put up slick English language media and They can do it through social media forums along with dedicated forums. And we need to, looking across the community, think of the different ways that we can to interrupt specifically or particularly technical instructions, but also to do what we can at home and in communities to hope that we're not fallow land for the message of taking violent action.
Next question. Sir. Mic way over there. One mic. Can't be shut down? John, you just can't shut down Inspire? Short answer.
I'll broaden it out, but no, I don't think you can simply shut down the ability to reach a U.S. audience from this type of propaganda. When you can make it more difficult, but not just shut it down.
I'm sorry, go ahead, sir. Wait, right back in the back. Wait, then we'll get to you next.
David Ignatius, I would like to ask the panel to address the question of whether overt legal authorities can be found for the kind of counterterrorism efforts that you're considering in the Middle East. According to news reports, the president last month set up legislation that included $500 million for a Title X stabilization force to train Syrian rebels. That didn't last long on Capitol Hill from what we hear, and is being re-examined in part because of questions about legal authorities and whether you can do Title X military training by special forces in these situations. Since that seems to be central to the president's idea of what to do going forward, could you speak about how it might work legally in Syria and Iraq?
Well, I'm glad I have my lawyer here with me, so.
Go for it, John.
Looking out at Secretary Johnson, is there anyone who's a special expert on DoD authorities? Without getting granular, let me give a broader answer, which is that what you're hearing and what you've in particular reported upon and we're seeing is an incredibly complicated situation right now with small-scale threats in a variety of different countries and regions. And so I think whoever the executive is, what we're looking for when you have these discussions and you're looking at a particular threat in a particular place at a particular time and you want to respond quickly and nimbly to that threat is, what can we do with the existing authorities so that the lawyer in the room doesn't say, that's a total common sense, right policy move to do, but you can't do it because that particular fund is labeled for a particular purpose and you've run out of the dollars in that fund, so you can't take what everyone agrees or may agree is the right policy call to move quickly. And if you want to do it, you have to go in a laborious process to get a change in authority. And so fundamentally what they're looking to do is come up with a more flexible structure so that you can address the terrorist threat, provide the support to the partner that you want to provide, and do it in a timely fashion.
Just one quick note. I do think there's a broader fundamental question about what are our authorities writ large with the changing landscape of the terrorist threats. The question of the authorization for the use of military force, which was constructed broadly to deal with post 9/11 to go after Al-Qaeda and associated movements. That's in question when you look at the Islamic State, which is literally not a part of Al-Qaeda and has been disavowed. And so the question is, do you have authority under those auspices to go after lethally that movement? Under that authority, the answer is no. There's probably some creative lawyering that could be done, John, on this. But I think there's a fundamental question moving forward. What is the architecture of authorities to be able to use all of the tools against the multiplicity of actors out there that could threaten the United States?
Yeah, and I would just add, is you look at the war against Al-Qaeda, the situation in Iraq and Syria, without getting too specific, as you look across our instruments of power, you face different domestic or international legal challenges you have to solve in each case, and it's why then sometimes you would favor one over the other for that reason, as well as perhaps policy reasons. But we work through this on a daily basis.
So in the end, the lawyers make the decision.
They help
like every other place in the world.
Well, we keep them close at hand. Let's
Tom,
put it that way.
now stand up.
Dr. Vickers, does the Assad regime have excellent intelligence about our enemies in Syria? And are we utilizing it, and are our partners in Europe utilizing it?
No and no. The Assad regime has lost its legitimacy. It doesn't control the bulk of its territory. It can project power on a temporary basis into various areas, but they've got 100,000 plus insurgents who've been fighting a 3-year war. And so, they've got a number of challenges in prosecuting that war, intelligence being one of them. The Syrian state that existed of old is not the Syrian state of today. That said, working with other partners, Europeans and partners in the region, we have good visibility.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. There's one threat which was not mentioned by the panel. That's nuclear terrorism. This is very much in the news. Like 10 years ago, there was 84 missing, unaccounted for Russian suitcase bombs. And people like former Secretary of Defense William Perry still say he believes there's a 50% chance that there'll be a nuclear detonation somewhere in the world in the next 5 years. Plus, there's also the threat of dirty bombs with plutonium. So my question is this still a concern for the government? And what is the U.S. doing about it?
Yes, it's a concern, and I think we have a panel on that topic later, so we don't want to steal their thunder. But yes, and again, we chase down every lead. After 9/11, it was a very different environment. We've had some that we've taken very seriously. Turned out not to be the case, but
Is it real? Are suitcase nuclear weapons?
Well, there are nuclear weapons of varying sizes, I would say. I would say some of that stuff was exaggerated. Yeah. But if a state lost control of a weapon and it got in the hands of a terrorist, that would be a nightmare scenario. Is it?
Brian, just a quick point on this. President Obama has actually done a lot to bring world leaders and attention on this issue. Folks forget his first major sort of summit in Washington was on precisely this issue. So a lot of credit to the president. He continued a lot of what President Bush was doing, frankly, but there's been a lot of public and political attention to it.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Steve Shapiro from New York. I work with an organization called BENS, Business Executives for National Security. John, we've spoken about this. If I might direct the question to Secretary Vickers and then with a follow-up to the other two knowledgeable panelists. Your role as Undersecretary for Intelligence includes management of a lot of sub-agencies, including DIA and all sorts of operations that have domestic implications. You have a lot of military domestically based, of course, thankfully. And I wonder if you could talk about the role of your department, your division, your department, with respect to domestic intelligence, how you interact with other domestic intelligence structures and processes, FBI, JTTFs, Justice, local PDs. Obviously, Fort Hood was an issue with respect to that. This is not a civil liberties question. It's really a structures and processes question, which is what we're looking at. And then if I could just ask John and Juan to follow up with respect to the authorities question domestically. I know, Juan, you're focused internationally, but the domestic authorities, and John, of course, that's your day job as well, the domestic authorities. If any are new, necessary, what's the story with respect to that? Because obviously my question comes from the premise that the domestic side is not given enough attention. Thank you.
You have 1 minute and 30 seconds, so right ahead.
Okay, so the FBI is the lead, and so both in the technical intelligence realm with NSA, we work extremely closely with them, but they're the authorities' basis for us. And then on human intelligence collection, again, we're the junior partner. We support FBI and CIA, and it's very important to be integrated against foreign targets in the United States. But DOD is, particularly on the DIA side that you referred to, is the smallest of the three by far.
I'd say when you're operating domestically, in particular, your concerns about civil rights and civil liberties and how to exercise the power that the government has responsibility are at their height, as is the threat, since there are people located at home. And so it's been one where the steps that you can take to prevent an act from occurring are necessarily limited, and you've had to use your traditional criminal authorities in order to obtain the information, and also programs like See Something, Say Something that involve the awareness of the citizenry. In terms of additional authorities, I mean, one area that we have to continue to watch, I think, is to ensure that if you get a lawful court order through a traditional criminal authority, that you have the recipient of that order has the ability to execute it.
The only thing I'd say, we didn't talk a lot about it on this panel, no doubt it'll be touched on by others, how you deal with countering violent extremism and the ideology that drives these groups, right? And that becomes a very difficult constitutional and legal issue domestically. The government shouldn't be policing thought, but it is an ideology that's driving the motivations of many of these individuals. And so the tough job of the Department of Justice, Secretary Johnson at DHS and others is to think about how you map the problem and then intervene and do it constitutionally. That's a very difficult problem moving forward.
Well, I want to thank all three of you. You've helped set the stage for what's going to be a very exciting next couple of days, and thank you very, very much.